Okay, so the lesson I'm teaching is for first graders, and there's a first grade ELA standard that says identify the main idea and key details from a text. So that's what this lesson is going to be all about. So the way I'm going to start this lesson is I'm going to tell students that I have some mystery bags today that have some objects in them, and that I need their help in coming up with the big idea of the bag, so what the bag is all about. So I would start with the first bag. And I might just make it, make it fun, make it engaging, have a student come up and pull out the objects one by one, and the rest of the class can shout out what the objects are. So we have a spatula, a whisk, and an oven mitt. So I would instruct the class to turn to their elbow partner, maybe the person sitting next to them, and to just talk about what they think the big idea of that bag is. So what is the bag mostly about? It did have these three things in it: a whisk, a spatula, and an oven mitt. But what is the bag all about? What is the big idea of the bag? So then I would give them just a couple minutes, maybe even just a minute, this shouldn't take long, to talk to their partner, and then I would ask for some ideas. So I'd say, okay, raise your hand if you want to share with me what you and your partner came up with as the big idea of the bag. And, there might be different answers there, but hopefully someone would say kitchen tools or things you use to cook. Anything along those lines would be fine. I suspect that there might be some students who would say things you stir with, or, give some other answers that aren't quite on track. So I would lead the class in a discussion about why these are not all things that you stir with. We don't stir with an oven mitt. So once everyone kind of agrees that the big idea of the bag is kitchen tools or things you use to cook, I would say, okay, so I'm going to write that on this bag. I'm going to write kitchen tools. And then I might ask, so why didn't I write whisk on the bag? Is this a whisk? Was this a whisk bag? And, I would kind of get the students to see and to articulate in their own way that the bag was not all about a whisk. A whisk was one thing in the bag, but the big idea of the bag, or what it was all about, was kitchen tools. So then I would introduce this little graphic organizer, and I would say, okay guys, so there's a big box up on top, and this says big idea. So that's where I'm going to write what the big idea of the bag was. What was the big idea of the bag again? Yes, kitchen tools. So here I'm going to write that. Tools. And then I'll say, and what were the three things in the bag again? What were the three items? And so, of course, they would name the spatula and the oven mitt and the whisk. And the reason that I'm doing it on the chart as well as just talking about it and writing the label on the bag is that this visual is going to transfer when we start talking about the text. So I thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and sort of introduce them to the idea that the big idea or the main idea goes up top, and then we haven't introduced the word details yet, but the smaller details go along the bottom here, because they're going to see that once we get to the organizer that we use in the text. So then I would go right on to the next example, which is the same concept, but just one more example to really get them to grasp this whole big idea concept. I would say, okay, it's time for mystery bag number 2. I'd have a student come up, and same thing again. They would just pull one at a time out of the bag. We have goggles and sunscreen and an arm floaty. So I'd go through the same process again of saying, okay, turn to your partner, and I want you to think about these 3 items. And don't just think about each item by itself, but think about them all together. And what is the big idea of that second mystery bag? Then I'd ask for their input. We'd talk through different answers, and we would come up with the fact that the big idea of the second bag was pool things. So I'd say, yes, I'm going to label this bag pool things. Now, why didn't I label the bag goggles? Right, because the bag was not all about goggles. Goggles were one thing in the bag, but the bag's big idea, what it was mostly about, was things you use at the pool, or pool things. Then we would pull this chart back out. Say, okay, so what was the big idea again of that second bag? Well, let's start with the items this time. What were the 3 items in the bag? And they would have to recall there was an arm floaty, there was sunscreen, and there were goggles or a swim mask. So I would say, okay, what was the big idea again? What are these things all about? What is the big the big idea? And they would say pool things, or things you take to the pool, or maybe to the beach. I'd say yes. So the big idea is in the top box here, and then there's a line going to each of the items, or the smaller things that were in the bag. So then I would set that aside just for a minute. And now I would transition from the real life objects into talking about the text and what we mean by main idea in a text. So I would say, hey class, I want you to know that when we read a story, or really any kind of text, there's usually a main idea. Just like each of these bags had a main idea, there's usually some kind of big idea that the story is all about. And when we're talking about stories, we don't usually say big idea, we usually say main idea. So that's a new word for you. Everybody say main idea. Main idea. And then I would refer to yesterday's work to kind of help them remember what we did the day before. And originally I was thinking I would introduce this Rex's New Dog story in the current lesson, but then I thought, in first grade they're really still learning to decode words and struggling a little bit with written text, and I didn't want that to be what this lesson is about. I thought it might be better if we're working with familiar text. So I thought maybe the day before we would have gone through this story, read it together, figured out all the words. They could read in partners, we'd read it out loud, and then we would have gone through these comprehension lessons or questions. So in today's lesson, I would just briefly refer back to the story about Rex's New Dog. I might quickly re-ask the comprehension questions just to make sure everyone is remembering it, and maybe some students weren't here that day. We could read through it again quickly, maybe do some choral reading and read it all together until everyone's on the same page with what happens in this story. And then I would say, so our job now is to figure out, and I would have this posted from yesterday somewhere in the classroom, maybe up on the board, so we'll put it there. And then I would say our job today is to figure out what the big idea of that story is. So yesterday we read the story, and today we're going to break it apart and we're going to figure out the big idea of the story. And we're going to talk about, and this is a new word, so listen carefully, we're going to talk about the details. So the details of the story are things that are in the story that support the main idea, but they're not what the story is all about. So when we were doing our things we use at the pool bag, sunscreen was a detail, but it wasn't the big idea. So then I will introduce this worksheet here, and I would say, I would also have the Rex's New Dog story posted. And I would say, okay, so this should look familiar. We just did a chart like this with our things you use in the kitchen bag and our things you take to the pool bag. In this one, what do you think goes in this big box? The main idea, what the story is mostly about, or the details? Yes, that's right. The main idea goes in the big box. So we need to figure out what the main idea of Rex's New Dog story is. And on this worksheet, we have 3 choices. So everyone look down to the bottom, and we're going to read these together. So put your finger on the one that's on the top, and let's read that together. Rex throws a ball for his dog. Do you think the story that we just read and that we read yesterday is all about Rex throwing a ball for his dog? Raise your hand if you do. Okay, and raise your hand if you don't. And then I might ask, can someone explain, why do you think that's not the main idea? And they would give their input, and we would talk about it, and we would decide that yes, Rex throwing a ball for his dog is in the story, but the whole story is not about that. So we're going to decide that that's a detail. And then we'd move on to the next one. Rex loves to play with, actually next I'd go to the other detail. They run and jump and chase each other. Let's think about that for a minute. Turn to your partner and talk about if you think that's the main idea, the big idea of the story, that Rex and his dog run and jump and chase each other. So just turn and talk for a minute. And then I'll give the class a minute to share their ideas, and I'd ask for a volunteer to share with the class. And we would decide together that, yes, they run and jump and chase each other is in fact in the story, but that the story is not mostly about that. So anyway, we'd come down to finally working out which thing goes where, and I would show the class that, or they would have decided and agreed by this point that Rex loves to play with his dog is the big idea of the story. The other things, let's see, I think I lost my highlighter. Here it is. These other things, Rex takes his dog to the park. I'm going to highlight that. They run and jump and chase each other. Rex throws a ball for his dog. Those are all details in the story, but those are just one sentence, one detail. Whereas the main idea of the story is up here. Rex, he loves to play with his dog. So again, I would show them that on the bottom of the worksheet, there were 3 choices, and that our job is going to be to cut those apart and decide which one goes where in our chart. So as a group, we would agree, work out all our disagreements, that Rex loves to play with his dog goes in the top box because that's the big idea of the story. And then there are a couple details, and I would keep using that word details and say details support the main idea. They're in the story, but they're not what the story is all about. So I'd put those down here in the details boxes. And so after we go through this as a class, I'm going to leave this model, this example worksheet up here, and I'm going to give each of the students a worksheet to work on. So today they're pretty much just going through the motions of copying what we did together as a group, but that's okay because it's still going to be difficult for some of them. Some of them are not going to be able to read all the words. Some of them might just have an issue remembering what goes where. So we're working through those things today with me walking around the classroom. I'm going to instruct them to work with a partner, and I'm going to match up the partners so that at least one person in each group, or they might work in small groups, but where at least one person in each group can read these fluently and tell their group members what they say. So again, I'm going to pass out the worksheets. I'm going to tell them that they need to cut these rectangles apart, decide which one is the main idea. If they're confused, they can look back up here at the sample. And again, today is just going through the motions of what we just did together as a class. And then again, I'll be walking around and helping them with any trouble they have. And then once we wrap that up, I would just wrap up by saying, okay, you guys did great today. So I would remind them the main idea is what the story is mostly about. I would probably have them say that back to me, and I would post that on the wall. The main idea is what the story is mostly about. And then, again, I would also reiterate the word details and what that means. And I would tell them that tomorrow we're going to read a different story together, and that they are going to go through this with their group and see if they can figure out which of the choices is the main idea and which is the details. So I think this is a really good lesson because it starts out with the hands-on objects, the real life objects, and they can pretty easily see that the bag is all about kitchen things, or this bag is all about things you take to the pool or to the beach. And I hope that transfers over to, in the story, the slightly more abstract or much more abstract idea of a main idea in a story, and how the main idea of the story is what it's all about. The language supports built in here are the real objects, being able to talk with their partners about their ideas, and then to work with a partner when they're actually doing the cutting and pasting and that kind of work. And then having the example worksheet up and the highlighted text, those are both good language supports that the kids can refer to if they're feeling a little lost. And so I feel like this lesson could be good for everyone from, across the board. It's just a really good lesson with good language supports. So that's my first grade lesson. Thank you.